18 degrees as you're stepping out the door right about now under a glorious sunshine. Gonna cloud up later on today. Could see some rain as well. Humax will make it feel like 36 today. This is a really neat story. It's described as the first of its kind in Canada. A sex worker in Halifax has won a lawsuit after suing a client for non-payment of services. So here are the details. Former sex worker Brogan Sheehan took Bradley Samuelson to small claims court after he did not fully pay her fee, which both parties had agreed to beforehand. Samuelson argued that the agreement was invalid because it is illegal to purchase sexual services, even though he did. But a court adjudicator said the contract could still be enforced and awarded Sheehan, the former sex worker, $1,800. Now, as you may or may not know, sex work is still criminalized in Canada. Paying for it is illegal, although offering sex for money is not illegal after a 2014 law removed criminal penalties for people who sell sexual services. Yelena Vermillion is the executive director of the Sex Workers Action Program Hamilton, SWAP Hamilton, also a YWCA Hamilton Woman of Distinction Award nominee, and joins us now on Good Morning Hamilton. Yelena, good morning. Welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Rick. How are you? Nice to have me back. Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming back on the show. I want to start with this. How often does non-payment of services happen? Is it rarely? Is it often?
Oh, it's so common. You have, well, first of all, I need to correct a piece of information which is widely misreported.
Okay.
So it is an illegal act. It is a criminal act to sell sexual services. Many of the reporting on this topic has been inaccurate. So, and this is not without purpose. The Stephen Harper's government in 2014 responded to the Bedford lawsuit, which was successful. It was a lawsuit where three sex workers, Amy Lebovich, Terry Jean Bedford, its namesake, and Valerie Scott, sued the federal government, basically stating that when they followed the laws previously, which criminalized most parts of the transaction of a sexual service exchange, but not the sale, basically they told the government, you know, when we follow these laws, we're in danger. When we don't follow the laws, we're arrested, deported, our children are taken away from us, etc. They proved that to the government. Those laws were struck down. And then Stephen Harper's Conservative government had 1 year to institute the current laws we have now, PCEPA, Protections of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, also known as the Bill C-36, which governs our sex work law in Canada since 2014. That law, for the first time, actually criminalized the sale of sexual services. So it didn't remove criminal penalties, it actually added a new crime in Canada in the Canadian Criminal Code. So this is actually a very interesting precedent because on the letter of the law, this decision shouldn't have been made. We're very happy that this decision has been made. It's an interesting precedent. And I think that it just reflects the fact that sex workers are using the court systems in any way that they can, any infrastructure possible, to vindicate their rights as workers. You know, I think it reflects the kind of political atmosphere that sex workers have to live in and endure, where people are reporting about their lives, people are, you know, spreading misinformation, but really what it comes down to is that sex work is work. We are laborers who are othered in society, and our work is criminalized. So what we do when we are victims of, you know, non-payment, things like this, it's not often justified. It's not often we see this kind of justice rendered. What I think is really important to understand is that in a decriminalized context, if these criminal laws were not present in law in Canada, we wouldn't actually have an issue receiving, you know, that payment from the client who chose not to pay us. Because in New Zealand, where they have a decriminalized context, there isn't an aggressive or sort of an animus between sex workers and the police, because that criminal law has been removed. That conflict with the law has been removed. And so therefore those relationships, police and sex workers, when they are legitimate victims of violence, whether that be robbery, extortion, etc., they can actually contact the police in those contexts, pardon me. So in this case, you know, the sex worker, it wasn't a violent situation. That's wonderful. But she still didn't receive payment for service. And you have many clients who will enter an exchange with a sex worker with the intention of paying her or them less than what agreed to, or not at all, because they do believe with gall, with arrogance, that because they are aware of the selling or purchasing as being an illegal act, that they could get away with it. But this is wonderful because this small claims court case vindicates exactly that. A services was rendered. That's the hallmark of a verbal contract, of any contract, and regardless of the criminal law, we are pleased with the adjudicator's decision to vindicate the former sex workers' labor, and the fact that, an agreement was made. And that's the hallmark of a contract.
Appreciate the clarification on the legalities, because they are somewhat confusing when you kind of do some of the deep digging. So I appreciate that. I also want to ask you, is this a small step or maybe a big step towards potentially the decriminalization of sex work?
As far as its implication to the current federal lawsuit, which Swap Hamilton is a member of as a part of the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, I think it's relatively small. Small Claims Court doesn't have, as far as jurisprudence is concerned, the ability to instruct other courts how to act, meaning when another Small Claims Court judge is presented with similar facts, they are not bound by the previous judge's decision. And because, of course, it's Small Claims Court, it's not Supreme Court, all other courts in the context of either criminal or civil matters aren't instructed, they aren't forced to follow that. They aren't bound, to follow that decision that the previous judge, the adjudicator, made. So it is a step in the right direction. It is a precedent that is wonderful, that can be used as structure. But ultimately, we don't need small claims recourse towards our rights. If we were in a decriminalized context, which the current federal lawsuit against the charter right now, the charter challenge, aims to vindicate, much like the Bedford case did vindicate, we wouldn't have to, sue people necessarily. We could literally just have conversations with police if we were, for example, in New Zealand, there's a very prominent example of a sex worker who was not paid after services were rendered. She called the police. The police officer told the client, you need to pay her or you will be charged with extortion. So, different mechanisms are available when the criminal law is removed. And we would ideally want to see, more immediate action being able to be taken as opposed to long, stressful, arduous court processes, which don't always result in positive outcomes, of course, for those seeking justice. So, the current criminal laws in Canada, they violate Charter's rights of sex workers, the right to life, liberty, and security, equality and non-discrimination, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. So ultimately, we just want to do away with the criminal law. We do hope that our federal case will be successful. It was heard in October 3rd to 7th of last year in the Ontario Superior Court, and we're just waiting for a decision to come down by the judge probably by the end of the summer. So, yeah.
That should be interesting. Also interesting and empowering, this court decision in Halifax, and I'm sure that many others are looking at it to say, well, this could be that small step towards better days and decriminalization. Yelena, we'll have to leave it there. Really appreciate your time as always this morning.
Thank you so much, Rick. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Yelena Vermillion, Executive Director of the Sex Workers Action Program Hamilton, Swap Hamilton. More details online at swaphamilton.com.
Thank you so much, Rick, for having me on today. The one thing I wanted to add to that I forgot to mention is that in clarifying that right now it is a criminal act to sell sexual services, the only thing that people get confused about is the fact that there is an immunity from prosecution for an individual selling their own sexual services. Now, in practice, that does not mean that sex workers who sell their own sexual services aren't targeted. They are. They are targeted, harassed, and surveilled by police daily. The difference is that it still is considered an illegal act. It is still named in the Canadian Criminal Code. Therefore, we are still considered criminals. That is the distinction that people have a hard time understanding, and that's why it's reported so inaccurately often. And that was the goal of the Stephen Harper's government, was to confuse people, make people think that this was an issue that was over with, that was dealt with. So yeah, thanks so much. Enjoy.